So tonight, the 5th of September 2011, we are here to listen to Sifu Gary Ko's the second lecture on the history of China, and with a focus on the Shang and the Zhao dynasty. Xia Shang Zhou, Shang Zhou Cao. And with this, I would like to invite our Grandmaster Sifu Gary Ko to give us this lecture and a seminar tonight.
Xiangqiu, or Shang dynasty, is possibly the first dynasty, ancient dynasty of China that at this moment in time is accepted by the world at large as a complete, verifiable dynasty of the Chinese people. Now, I'm always wary to give exact dates because the beginning or the end of a dynasty is always open to subjective debate. Sometimes somebody says if the last emperor of the last dynasty died or was captured or the army surrendered, that was the end of the dynasty. And some would say, no, this dynasty began because it was already the biggest power of the land. And it may not have conquered the earlier dynasty yet, but since they were the biggest already, the start date is when they were the biggest or the mightiest. So there are a lot of room for arguments. And sometimes in Chinese history, as in history all over the world, there are instances when the country is ruled by more than one ruler. Or the person who is called the king or the emperor, whatever the case may be, is only a figurehead. The real ruler is the queen mother or the uncle, regent. So, or other factions that claim to be what we call hegemons, or Chinese call ba. So in history, you'll find that there are a lot of ba. And sometimes the ba is more powerful than the Wang or the Wang Dai. So exact dates, they're a little bit soft. But Shang dynasty is usually seen to have begun about 4,000 years ago. Anything between 1600 BC to close to 2000 BC. Now, the historical artifacts suggest that there is a place called Erlitou, where, somewhere in Henan, where they have found things that are traceable back to maybe even 4,000 plus 5,000 years ago. They haven't ascribed a dynasty to it yet. So is that the earlier part of Shang dynasty, or is that the Xia dynasty, which people have talked about for a long time but haven't found enough tangible proof to say that it exists? So I have begun my teaching of Chinese history and civilization on the premise that Shang dynasty is the first proven dynasty, the world accepts it, and I didn't talk much about the Xia dynasty. But herein I'll mention a little bit about the Xia dynasty because if you understand Chinese history, at least as passed on by the ancient people, there was a Xia dynasty that goes back 4,000 plus 5,000 years ago. And the Xia dynasty was coming to an end when the Shang dynasty was coming up. Now, first, let's get back to Chinese geography so you understand what we're talking about. China today is obviously one of the largest countries in the world. Population-wise, it is the largest. I think physical size is one of the largest too. But the boundaries of China have shifted throughout history and kept shifting. And one thing you have to appreciate about China, and I'm sure the Chinese authorities today, as they have in the past, would appreciate, is that they have always had the most land boundary shared with the most nations in the world. It's always been the case, and it's still the case today. No country in the world today, in the year 2011, have as many neighboring nations as China has. And in the past, it was even more so, because in the past there were even more nations or tribes or cultures that were different to China's nationality. Now, today we have the United Nations and we have diplomacy and we have nations more well versed and prepared to accept diplomacy or work within some kind of framework of diplomacy. In the old days, this was not the case. In the old days, and I'm talking about the Shang dynasty here, 3,000 plus 4,000 years ago, diplomacy was not a very well developed art. And when you share borders with many other different nations or states or different tribal groups, you are in constant warfare. So when I tell you about the Shang dynasty, one word must come to your mind: constant warfare. War is the order of the day, because that you shared so many boundaries with so many other nations. All right, let me put things into perspective. Today I'm going to take a non-mainstream point of view. If you study history books, most history books will tell you, and most researchers will tell you, that Shang dynasty was a dynasty that was not well regarded, and is still not well regarded by the Chinese people, or treated kindly by historians. 商朝呢，就係俾到人一個比較負面嘅個印象，因為太多歷史家、太多哲學家就用商朝嚟比周朝。咁呢兩個朝代嚟比，咁周朝呢係可以話中國文化個高點，係有好多高人，好多哲學家，亦有好多可以話好有權威，亦好有本能，亦好善良嘅國王，所以用商朝嚟相比周朝呢，係令到商朝呢令到我哋評價商朝呢就比較差啲，覺得商朝係唔係一個咁好嘅朝代。In truth, the Shang dynasty shouldn't be just compared with the succeeding dynasty, which is the Zhao dynasty, because the Zhao dynasty really represents, in a sense, the longest dynasty in Chinese history and the longest dynasty in the world, in which time China's philosophers of the highest level, the China's military strategies, painters, poets, artists, craftsmen, and most of all kings and statesmen appeared. And so the Zhao dynasty really represents, to some extent, almost a fairy tale period where the best and brightest of the Chinese congregated in that 800 plus years. So to use the Shang dynasty to make a direct comparison with the Zhao dynasty alone perhaps is not the best way, in my humble opinion. I would think that a fairer comparison for the Shang dynasty is to compare with with what existed at that time around the world. What did the world have to offer vis-a-vis the Shang dynasty? I think then you get a better picture, a fairer picture of what the Shang dynasty was all about. All right, so let's begin from the beginning. The Shang dynasty was, before it became a dynasty, was a very strong tribal organization that honed its skills in warfare, because they were surrounded by everybody and they had to fight them all the time. So basically they were found somewhere in the region of the north, northwest, and a little bit of central China. So those of you who are familiar with Chinese geography, they would come up to as far north as a little bit past Beijing in the Hebei region, and sometimes spilling over into the borders in the northeast into the Liaoning province and so forth. And then back on the western side, it occupied Shanxi, Ximsai, Gamsok, Lingha, parts of that, and then curving back down to Shansai and Holam, and some parts of Wubak Wudam, and Shandong region. So it takes most of about central and a little bit northwestern, northeastern China. Of course, the borders varied. Now, story has it that there was this very great man, and I think you would agree with me if you hear what he has done. This very great man, we call him the first king of the Shang dynasty. His name was Tong, as in soup. Xiang Tong Wang. He was the first king of the Shang dynasty. Now he's a very great man because what he managed to do was he managed to assemble in his time an incredibly powerful, incredibly disciplined, incredibly well-trained and organized army. His armed force was so strong that there was no parallel in the world at his time. He had 1,000 chariots in his final battle against the Xia dynasty. 1,000 chariots in his time was unheard of. Let me give you an idea what scale meant. In his time, there were chariots in middle, Middle Asia, some parts of Mesopotamia area and some parts of Egypt. But we are talking about dozens of chariots. For him to assemble 1,000 chariots, it's a huge, huge logistical thing to do. Now, aside from that, he defeated his enemies and the Xia dynasty and created the Shang dynasty. Now, when we talk about China, a few things must be borne in mind. One is scale. The Shang dynasty, at its peak, it lasted close to 550 plus years. That's a long time. At its peak, the Shang dynasty had something like 14-15 million people. 14-15 million people 4,000 years ago is a huge figure. To give you a comparison, Rome 2,000 years later had 1 million people and it was considered one of the largest cities in the world. It was like frightening to the world, 1 million people. But these guys had a nation of 14 to 15 million people 2,000 years before Rome. To make a comparison, the greatest armies at that time were in Egypt, Mesopotamia region, and they never mounted close to even 800,000, let alone 1 million people. The whole population of the nation. And their military never amounted more than 50-60,000 people. These guys had a standing army close to 750,000 people. Today, after the populations have grown so exponentially, there are a handful of nations that have 500,000 people standing army. Today, in their time, 4,000 years ago, they had a standing army in excess of 500,000 people. And in the final battle against the Zhao dynasty, they mustered 700 plus thousand people. That's a huge army. They had 550,000 standing regulars and about 180,000 what they call gladiatorial army. So whenever they conquered a tribe or conquered some other nation, they brought their best soldiers across, continued to train them, and kept them as a special unit. So in their final battle, they had assembled close to 750,000 standing troops to fight. Never in the history for the next 2,000-3,000 years did anybody come close to that. So they were a seriously powerful military unit. Okay, when the first king, Tang, conquered the Xia dynasty, he did many things. He listened to the advice of his great prime minister, a guy by the name of Yi Yin. In fact, when Shang's first king was not king yet, he was head of his tribe. He had ambitions to conquer all around him and be the master of his destiny. He felt something was missing. For all his troops, for all his training, for all his preparedness, he felt something was missing. And he heard that there was actually a great wise man who was a slave. And this man is called Yi Yin in Chinese history.